On a crowded city bus in Boston, 89-year-old Frank Sullivan struggles to find his fare card with trembling hands. "You're holding everyone up, old man," the impatient driver snaps, motioning for him to exit. As other passengers grumble about the delay, no one notices the carefully folded uniform in Frank's worn shopping bag, the same uniform he wore on D-Day, leading men onto Omaha Beach. But when a young Marine in dress blues boards the bus and spots the Purple Heart pin on Frank's faded jacket, he realizes they're about to throw off one of the last surviving heroes of World War II. What happens next will shame an entire city and remind America about the debt we owe to a generation we're quickly forgetting. Like and subscribe to follow this heart-wrenching story about respect, sacrifice, and how a single moment of kindness can expose the true cost of our indifference to those who gave everything for our freedom. Frank Sullivan had been making this bus trip every Thursday for 40 years. The VA hospital was only 3 miles away, but his legs didn't work like they used to. Not since Omaha Beach, where German shrapnel had torn through his right knee. Today was different. The regular driver, Mike, who knew Frank's story and always held the bus an extra moment when he saw him coming, was out sick. The replacement driver drummed his fingers impatiently as Frank searched his pockets for his fare card. "Come on, old-timer," the driver called out. "There's people trying to get to work." Frank's hands trembled more with each passing second. He'd had the card when he left his small apartment, the one he'd lived in since coming home from the war, now surrounded by gleaming high-rises and coffee shops where his old neighbors' houses used to be. "I'm sorry," he said softly, still searching. "I know it's here somewhere." A woman in business attire checked her watch dramatically. A teenager with headphones muttered something about "these old people." No one offered to help. "Look," the driver said, "you need to either pay or get off. You're holding up the whole route." Frank felt shame burning in his cheeks. In his shopping bag, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was his old army uniform. Every Thursday he'd take it to the VA to show young wounded veterans, to remind them that there was life after war, that their sacrifices mattered. "Please," Frank said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been riding this route since before you were born. If I could just sit down, I'm sure I'll find the card." "Rules are rules," the driver insisted. "No fare, no ride." As Frank turned to step down, his bad knee buckled. He caught himself on the handrail, but his shopping bag slipped, spilling its contents. The carefully preserved uniform fell onto the dirty bus floor. A young man in Marine dress blues, who had just boarded through the back door, suddenly called out, "Wait!" He moved quickly to the front, bending to help Frank gather his belongings. As he picked up the uniform, his eyes caught sight of the ribbons and patches. Distinguished Service Cross, Purple Heart, 29th Infantry Division patch. "Sir," the Marine said, his voice filled with quiet awe, "were you at D-Day?" Frank nodded, embarrassed by the attention. "Omaha Beach. Second wave." The Marine straightened to his full height, turning to face the driver and passengers. "Do any of you know what this man did? What that uniform represents?" The bus had gone completely silent. This gentleman helped liberate Europe, fought Nazi Germany, watched his friends die so we could all ride on this bus and complain about being a few minutes late to work. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own fare card. "Sir, please use my card. It would be an honor." But another passenger had already stood up, an elderly Vietnamese man who had been quietly watching the scene unfold. "No," he said firmly, pulling out his wallet. "I will pay. My family found refuge here after Saigon fell. Men like him," he gestured to Frank, "made America a place that would take us in. I pay." One by one, other passengers began to stand. A woman whose grandparents had survived the Holocaust. A young teacher who taught World War II history. Each wanted to pay Frank's fare to make right what they had almost let go so wrong. The driver, who had been getting redder by the moment, finally spoke. "Sir, please, just get on, no charge." but Frank stood straight, despite his bad knee screaming in protest. "Number, these people need to know. Not for me, but for the men who never came home. The ones who never got to ride buses or raise families or grow old." He pulled out an old photograph from his wallet. Young men in uniform, smiling despite knowing what waited for them on that French beach. "Only 3 of us made it home from our platoon," he said quietly. "I promised I'd live enough for all of them." The young Marine, who introduced himself as Sergeant James Martinez, insisted on sitting next to Frank for the ride. The other passengers, now silent and attentive, couldn't help but listen as the 2 soldiers, separated by generations but united by service, talked quietly. "I carry their pictures," Frank said, carefully opening his worn wallet. "Every Thursday, I show them to the young wounded veterans at the VA to remind them they're not alone." He pointed to each face in the faded photograph. "That's Tommy O'Brien. He was 19, from Kansas. Never saw an ocean before D-Day. That one's Michael Cohen. Had a girl waiting back home. I still write to her sometimes. She never married." Martinez listened intently as Frank named each man, telling their stories, keeping their memories alive. The bus had gone completely quiet, passengers straining to hear every word. "This is why I go every Thursday," Frank continued. "The wounded boys at the VA, they think they're alone in their struggles. I show them these pictures, tell them these stories, show them my own scars. It helps them understand they're part of something bigger than themselves." The businesswoman who had checked her watch earlier was now wiping tears from her eyes. The teenager had removed his headphones, listening with rapt attention. "Sir," Martinez said, "would you mind if I accompanied you to the VA today? My unit just lost 2 men in Afghanistan. Maybe hearing your stories would help." Frank smiled gently. "That's why I keep going. Every generation of soldiers needs to know they're not alone, that someone understands." As the bus approached the VA hospital, something unexpected happened. The driver, who had been silent since his earlier outburst, spoke up. "Sir," he called back, his voice thick with emotion, "my grandfather, he never talked about the war. Died taking his stories with him. I wish he'd had someone like you to share them with." Frank stood carefully, steadied by Martinez's strong arm. "That's why we have to remember, have to keep telling their stories, because when we forget the cost of war, we dishonor those who paid it." As they stepped off the bus, other passengers began to applaud, not the shallow, performative applause of obligatory gratitude, but the deep, meaningful recognition of having witnessed something profound. The Vietnamese man who had offered to pay approached Frank. "My father fought alongside American soldiers," he said quietly. "Men like you gave him hope that his children could have a better life. Thank you isn't enough." Frank reached out and squeezed the man's hand. "Living well, building a good life, that's how you thank us. That's what we fought for." The businesswoman rushed forward, handing Frank her card. "Please," she said, "I work for the City Transit Authority. I want to make sure you never have trouble riding the bus again. We'll arrange a special pass for you." But it was the driver who made the most meaningful gesture. He stepped down from his seat, walked to Frank, and saluted. "I'm so sorry, sir," he said, tears in his eyes. "I forgot what that generation sacrificed for us. I forgot to look past my own small inconveniences to see the giant standing before me." Inside the VA hospital, Frank's arrival created a stir unlike any other Thursday. Word had spread quickly. Some passengers had posted about the bus incident on social media, and the story was already going viral. In the rehabilitation ward, young veterans gathered around Frank and Martinez. Some in wheelchairs, others with prosthetic limbs or visible scars, all drawn to the old soldier who carried history in his shopping bag. "Show them the uniform, sir," Martinez suggested gently. Frank carefully unwrapped his old army uniform. Despite its age, it was perfectly preserved, each medal polished, each crease sharp. He laid it out on a table, and the young veterans gathered closer. "This stain here," Frank said, pointing to a dark mark on the sleeve, "that's from helping carry my best friend Tommy off that beach. He didn't make it to the medical tent." His voice cracked slightly. "Sometimes I think that's why I keep coming here, because somebody carried me when I was wounded, and now it's my turn to help carry others." A young soldier in a wheelchair, both legs missing below the knee, spoke up. "Sir, how did you deal with it? Some days I can't even look at myself in the mirror." Frank sat down beside him, his aged hands reaching for the young man's. "Son, what's your name?" "David, sir. David Mitchell." "Well, David, first thing you need to know is that mirror isn't showing you what's missing. It's showing you what survived, what endured." He rolled up his pant leg, revealing his own scarred knee. "This was my souvenir from Omaha Beach. Doctors said I'd never walk right again. But every step I take, even the painful ones, reminds me I'm alive to take them." Other veterans began sharing their stories. Afghanistan, Iraq, battles fought in places Frank had never heard of. But the wounds, the fears, the nightmares, those were the same. War hadn't changed, even if the locations had. A nurse who had been watching stepped forward. "Mr. Sullivan has been coming here every Thursday for 40 years, she told the group. "He's helped more veterans find their way back to life than any therapy program we have." Martinez, still in his dress blues, stood at attention. "Sir, would you share with them what you told me on the bus? About the pictures?" Frank opened his wallet again, but this time he didn't just show the photos. He began matching names and faces to stories about courage, about sacrifice, about the bonds that war creates and death can't break. "Tommy here. He pushed me down and took a bullet meant for me. Michael saved our entire unit by running through enemy fire to get a radio working. Johnny ... Frank's voice caught. "Johnny made me promise to live enough for both of us. Said somebody had to go home and tell the story right." The young veterans listened, many crying openly now. They understood what Frank was really sharing, not just war stories, but permission to feel, to hurt, to heal. By late afternoon, the VA hospital lobby had filled with reporters. The bus incident video had gone viral, and Frank's story was spreading across the nation. But Frank wasn't interested in cameras or interviews. He was still upstairs, sitting with a young Marine who'd been having thoughts of suicide. "You know what saved me?" Frank asked the young man quietly. "Not the medals, not the parades when we came home. It was the promises I made. To Tommy, to Michael, to all of them. They couldn't live their lives, so I had to live mine well enough for all of us." The Marine, barely 22, looked up with tears in his eyes. "But how do you deal with the guilt of being the one who made it?" Frank reached into his bag and pulled out something he rarely showed, his original dog tags, still stained with Tommy's blood. "You carry them with you," he said softly. "Not as a burden, but as a reason to live. Every morning I wake up and say their names. Every good thing I do it for them too. That's how we honor their sacrifice." Downstairs, the media chaos was growing. The city mayor had arrived, wanting to present Frank with a key to the city. Military officials were calling, talking about ceremonies and honors, but Frank stayed upstairs, doing what he'd been doing every Thursday for 40 years, helping young soldiers find their way back to life. Martinez had stayed too, his dress blues now a familiar sight on the ward. He'd called his commanding officer and requested permission to spend the rest of the day at the VA. "Sir," he'd said, "I'm learning more about leadership here than in any training course." As evening approached, a nurse came to tell Frank that a crowd had gathered outside the hospital. Word had spread through veterans groups, and hundreds of former service members had come to pay their respects. "They can wait," Frank said firmly, still holding the young Marine's hand. "This is more important." The young man had finally started talking about his own experiences, about the friends he'd lost, about the nightmares that wouldn't let him sleep. Frank listened as he'd listened to countless others over the decades. "You know what Tommy used to say?" Frank shared, his voice gentle. "He said the bravest thing a soldier can do isn't charging into battle. It's choosing to keep living after the battle's over." The young Marine nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. Will you be here next Thursday?" "Every Thursday," Frank promised. "Been doing it for 40 years, not going to stop now, and now you have to promise to be here too. Deal?" "Deal," the Marine whispered. As darkness fell outside, Frank finally stood to leave. His knee was aching and he was tired, but his heart was full. Martinez offered to drive him home, but Frank shook his head. "No," he said with a small smile. "I think I'll take the bus." When Frank stepped outside the VA hospital, he was stunned by what he saw. The street was filled with people, veterans young and old, many in uniform, forming a corridor of honor. As he appeared, they snapped to attention, saluting. The bus that had brought him was still there, but it wasn't alone. A line of city buses had parked along the street, their drivers standing at attention. The driver who had tried to throw him off that morning stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "Sir," he said, his voice breaking, "every bus in the city has been instructed to stop for you. Anytime, any place. You never have to worry about a fare again." But it was the faces in the crowd that brought tears to Frank's eyes. He recognized some of them. Veterans he'd counseled over the years, families he'd helped through grief, young soldiers he'd guided back to life. An older woman pushed through the crowd. Mary Cohen, Michael's sweetheart from all those years ago. She still wore the locket with his picture, had never married, just as she'd promised him before D-Day. "Frank," she said, hugging him tightly. "All these years, you've kept their memories alive, kept their stories going. Thank you." The mayor tried to make a speech, but Frank raised his hand. "If you want to honor us," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet crowd, "don't do it with ceremonies. Do it by remembering. Do it by helping the young ones who are fighting their own battles now." He gestured to the hospital behind him. "In there, right now, are brave men and women who need what my generation needed, understanding, patience, and most of all, someone to listen. That's worth more than any parade." Martinez, still by his side, spoke up. "Sir, would you share with them what you told us upstairs? About the promises?" Frank nodded slowly, pulling out the old photograph one more time. In the fading light, he named each face, each story, each dream that never came true. "We made promises to each other," he said. "The ones who came home promised to live for those who didn't, to make sure their sacrifice meant something, to build a world worthy of what they gave." He looked at the young Marine he'd spent the afternoon counseling, now standing straighter, hope returning to his eyes. "Every generation has its own war, its own battles, but the promises remain the same. We take care of each other. We remember. We live." The crowd stood silent, absorbing his words. Then, one by one, they began to share their own stories. Vietnam veterans telling of buddies lost in the jungle, Gulf War veterans remembering friends taken by IEDs, young soldiers speaking of comrades lost in distant mountains. As night fell, Frank finally boarded a bus home, but this time every passenger stood as he entered. The driver, a Vietnam veteran himself, refused to move until Frank was safely seated. Looking out the window at the dispersing crowd, Frank thought about Tommy, about Michael, about all the young faces in that old photograph. "I kept my promise, boys," he whispered. "I lived enough for all of us. And I'll keep living, keep telling your stories, as long as there are young soldiers who need to hear them." 1 year later, Frank Sullivan's Thursday visits to the VA had become something of a legend. Veterans from across the country made pilgrimages to meet him, to share their stories, to find healing in his quiet wisdom. The bus incident had sparked something larger than anyone expected. City transit systems nationwide had implemented Veterans Ride with Honor programs. Frank's story had inspired a movement of recognition and respect for elderly veterans, too often forgotten in their twilight years. But the most profound change was in the VA hospital itself. The ward where Frank spent his Thursdays had been officially named the Sullivan Center for Veteran Healing. It wasn't just a place for physical recovery anymore. It had become a sanctuary where old soldiers helped young ones find their way back to life. Martinez, the Marine who'd stood up for Frank that day on the bus, had been transferred to work with Veteran Outreach. Every Thursday, he sat beside Frank, learning the art of healing broken spirits through shared stories and understanding. The young Marine who'd been contemplating suicide now led support groups for other struggling veterans. "Mr. Sullivan taught me that surviving isn't just about making it home," he would say. "It's about helping others make it home too." On this particular Thursday, Frank arrived to find something special waiting. The veterans had gathered in the Sullivan Center, along with families of the men from his old unit. Children and grandchildren of those young faces in his worn photograph come to meet the man who had kept their memories alive. Tommy O'Brien's grandson, now a soldier himself, placed his grandfather's restored purple heart in Frank's trembling hands. "You carried him off that beach," he said softly. "You've been carrying his memory ever since. We want you to have this." Michael Cohen's sweetheart Mary, now in her 90s but still wearing that locket, brought letters Frank had written to her over the years. Each one sharing another memory of Michael, keeping his spirit alive long after his sacrifice. As Frank looked around the room at the faces, old and young, scarred and whole, grieving and healing, he saw the promise fulfilled. The promise made on a bloody beach in France, whispered between young men who knew they might not see tomorrow. "Live for us," they had said. "Tell our stories. Make it matter." The bus driver, who had almost thrown him off that day a year ago, was there too. He now volunteered at the VA, driving veterans to their appointments, listening to their stories, finding his own healing in service to others. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, "you didn't just teach us about the past, you taught us how to be better in the present." As the afternoon light filtered through the windows, Frank slowly stood. His bad knee still ached, would always ache, but he stood straight and proud. "Tommy," he said softly, naming each face in that old photograph one more time. "Michael, Johnny, look what your sacrifice built. Look how many lives you're still touching, still saving." He turned to the gathered veterans, his voice strong despite his age. "We carry them with us, not as a burden, but as a light. Every life we help, every soul we heal, we do it in their name. That's how they live forever." And in that moment, in that room filled with the weight of history and the hope of healing, the distance between generations vanished. Old soldiers and young ones united in understanding. Different wars, different battles, but the same heart. The heart of those who serve, who sacrifice, who choose to keep living so others might find their way home. Frank Sullivan had kept his promise, not just to those young men on Omaha Beach, but to every generation that followed. He had lived enough for all of them, loved enough for all of them, and in doing so had taught them all how to carry their own burdens with grace and purpose. If this story moved you, give it a like and hit subscribe for more incredible real-life stories that will change your perspective forever. See that video recommendation on your screen. Click it now for another touching story that will leave you speechless.